Welcome to a fantastic edition of Rebellion's educational series. I'm here with a brilliant mind, Sudip Gupta of Johns Hopkins, who I've actually known now for quite a few years. Sudip has been working on Nowcasting recently, and we're going to talk about that today, as well as reinforcement learning versus deep learning. So nowcasting is the prediction of the very near future and the very near past for a certain indicator. What have you found in your research so far? And thank you so much for coming on, of course, Professor.
Thank you, Alex. It's great to have you, and thank you for inviting me. And yes, so nowcasting is, as you mentioned, is something is about the very near future as well as probably the very recent past. And can we predict about what's going to happen in the very near future about some very important variables, for example, inflation, unemployment, GDP growth, or probably even the stock prices for a particular companies if we want to go at that micro level. So this has been a new area that people have been really getting interested in. It is a little bit different from forecasting, forecasting is about a little bit more distant future rather than nowcasting, which you really want to know what's about to happen next week, this day, 5 minutes down the line. So that's why it is so exciting. And so, of course, as I mentioned, there are various different areas where you can potentially nowcast. And one of the important ingredient of nowcasting would be what do you use as your secret sauce ingredients to come up with what's going to happen in the very near future. And it is gaining a lot of traction these days because we now have a lot of secret sauce available. One is in terms of the data that's coming in, which is a lot of alternative data that's potentially comes in, which could tell you about the individual problem at hand. And the second part is that we have that secret sauce or the technique which can blend the data together and come up with, and that's where the machine learning techniques are so useful because we have a huge data sets to predict a very short future of time. I can go into more detail. For example, I can talk about two very important things that we just worked on. One was nowcasting about the GDP growth of the US economy, and the other was nowcasting about the unemployment rate of the US economy. And both of them are at the weekly level. And and as you know that because of the recent COVID pandemic, it was a very important issue to know where the economy is going. Think about in March 2020, when the market really crashed, we are all wondering, is it going to be a V-shaped recovery? Is it going to be a W-shaped recovery? Is it going to be a K-shaped recovery? And that's where every week was so important because it had a sudden large drop, and then the economy started moving up, but we were not sure what's going to happen. And that's where the nowcasting figures that could be potentially come up with were so important. Now, on that context, the New York Fed, for example, has been doing nowcasting for some time using the traditional data. And they have been doing this for weekly nowcasting. So does the Atlanta Fed. So the difference between what the New York Fed and the Atlanta Fed did and what I did was I used the alternative data along with the traditional fundamental data and the technique, the machine learning technique, because we now have big data. So we cannot use the standard econometric techniques to do those type of nowcasting. Now here comes the important point that why is it important to have the alternative data? And here are some of the important issues. For example, think about, we want to know how people are moving across different locations and how are they spending across different locations to figure out about the impact on the overall economy and GDP and output and unemployment. And it is very difficult to get that information from traditional data because the traditional data is a little bit stale. They come probably in a monthly level or even at a much lower frequency level, as well as they are much more macro level than at the micro level, where we could potentially find out what's potentially is happening right now in the economy. And that's the main feature of nowcasting, because we really want to get to know what's going to happen right away. And that's the advantage of this alternative data. So for example, if I have the mobile location tower data. So just to talk about a little bit about alternative data, about how people are moving, that will give us a much better picture.
You can see local, Wendy's drive-throughs in the New York City region over a 3-day period.
Right. And think about, I'll give you another example. During the pandemic, a lot of people relocated, right? So think about they moved out of New York City and they went to suburbs or Florida and somewhere else. If we know their information that their credit cards are still originated from New York City because that's what their home address is, but they're being spent in Texas or in Florida or in some other Midwest, we can figure out and get an estimate of their migration, how people are moving away from the cities, and what is the impact that's going to happen on the local economy as well as the overall economy, how their spending pattern is going to change. Another information which I think the hedge fund people are using a lot, look at the location data of the satellite images, data of various malls and various other important shopping complexes, and see how many cars are there, for example, to see whether there are enough people who are coming back in to do the shopping or not. And so all of this information are what is we are using in the alternative data. We call it unstructured data. Another unstructured data is textual information, that what people are talking about in various news sources, various news outlets, and how can I bring those out right away? The sentiment in the market, the consumer sentiment, the way that the market is moving up and down. And all of these are affecting what is going to happen, for example, next week. And this is where the power of alternative data comes in. Now, all these different types of data sources, now if you club them together, this becomes very big data, right? So standard econometric technique, you cannot use it because you have more number of variables to estimate than the number of observations you have. And this is where the machine learning technique comes in. The other important feature of this data is some of this data are daily, some of them their data is weekly, some of the data is monthly. So if you're combining them together, you have to keep in mind that some part of the data is not moving in a particular period of time. So blending all of them together is a very important part, and that's where the mixed frequency data is very important in getting the nowcasting done. And we did that using something technical called sparse group lasso, which Eric Geisels has worked on at North Carolina. And then we came up with predictions for the US economy during the COVID period, as well as beyond the COVID period. And we tried to match that with what was going on with the New York Fed prediction. And it turned out that, well, ours was a lot more better. And that betterness comes from two sources. One is this alternative data, and the second one is the techniques that we have been using. And they are better in the sense their prediction error is relatively less than if you had otherwise be using the standard fundamental data.
So there's definitely going to be areas where nowcasting is ultra useful. But of course, when it comes to the micro level, there are certain companies where it's just going to be much tougher to apply it. I actually worked with your colleague, Jim Liu, on using nowcasting to look at mask usage via YouTube feeds in Times Square. That was a lot of fun. Well, moving on now to the big question of deep learning versus reinforcement learning. It's a question we come back to time and time again because it's one that I'm constantly asked on Wall Street, bank, hedge fund, data science executives. Where do you stand on the great debate?
Well, so there are various advantages and disadvantages of each of these, right? But if you, so deep learning is very good in predicting or finding out a really highly nonlinear functional form. Reinforcement learning, I actually like a lot about it because it kind of tells you how does the agent really behave and learns in the real world, and it builds that into the work. And that kind of brings us very closer to bring the machine into the way that our human minds work together. Think about whenever we were working, we always interact with the nature. That next level comes up, we are not only interacting with the nature, we are interacting with each other. And then we kind of behave and change our behavior depending on what kind of feedback we receive, right? So this kind of updating and this learning, and that's the fascinating part of bringing the machine closer to the way that the humans actually work and think. Deep learning, on the other hand, is very good in predicting a functional form. And you want a very strong nonlinear part, which could actually fit into the reinforcement learning framework. But you will not get into that interactive feature of the way that the individuals actually work. The disadvantage of reinforcement learning is, of course, it takes a lot of time to learn. So unless you really have a lot of variations in the agent's behavior, your learning may not be as accurate. But with the advent of new data and techniques, we are, I think, very well underway to overcome that challenge.
As Professor Michael Lippman likes to say, deep learning is more of a mechanism, whereas reinforcement learning is more of a learning program.
Right.
That's the way I feel. I mean, deep learning is something you can use to predict faces, and reinforcement learning is something to understand an environment. And so they can work together. And so that's the way I feel. Absolutely. They can very much work together. Yeah.
So you can get a very highly nonlinear ingredient into the deep learning, into the reinforcement learning framework, which is actually done through the deep learning, deep neural network or something else. But that comes as a predictive part of the reinforcement learning. But then how are you interacting, that is happening through the reinforcement learning. So if I see your face, I know that this is Alex. So how I see your face and map it to the images that I have in my mind, that you can always map using a deep learning framework. But then how I interact with it, that my interaction with Alex is going to be different than my interaction with somebody else, that learning is going to be completely separate part, which is only possible using reinforcement learning. You cannot do that in the deep learning framework.
Excellent. Well, this was a lot of fun. Do you have any parting thoughts on the state of the economy right now, or rates? Do you see the Federal Reserve following through with all of these rate hikes this year?
Well, that I think is potentially happening, the rate hikes, the latter part. How many is, of course, they have already said they're going to do 3. Some people are saying that's too less. Maybe they're going to come up with more. The important part is that, I think what is behind your question is that could there be potentially an hyperinflation coming up, and that kind of coincides with the rate hiking. And so that my thought is it's a little bit too early to talk about the hyperinflation, because we have a lot more mechanisms available with us than what we had in earlier periods when we saw that type of things. So it's too early to talk about hyperinflation, but a rate hike is going to be there. But think about that. We are currently, 1.85, 1.9 for 10-year yield. That is historically still very, very low, right? So we need to go back to at least an average standard. So that should be part of the expectation to begin with. And it was there like 2 years ago itself. So that should be there in the rate hike. And I think the market is already expecting that part of the rate hike.
Do you think we'll hit another 7-8% inflation this year?
I doubt.
So much of that is energy price growth, right?
Right, but then we have lots of alternatives to the energies that has potentially come up. One of the part of the inflation, and this I must say that we have to think about what is happening. Inflation is an outcome of the interaction of the supply and demand, right? Too little supply, too much demand is what going to drive the inflation through. Now, of course, in the COVID period, we did see that supply went down because of all the restrictions, lockdowns, and people feeling sick, and so on and so forth. So that went down, and the demand didn't go down. It did go down a little bit in the beginning, but then we have the stimulus, we have all this money coming up. So again, so we saw that both of this happening, and that led to the inflation, right? Now, whether this is going to continue, of course, we are going to see that the supply shocks are going to ease out over next couple of months over the time, in which part of that is related to COVID and how we are coming out of the COVID. And then the other part is, of course, how is the other part of the economy is doing. And then the demand cannot stay at that high level for such a long time. So having an 8%, 9% inflation for a longer period of time, I don't think that's going to. And then, of course, you'll have a proactive monetary policy potentially coming up, which would potentially stem this to.
Do you believe the Ukrainian situation is a contributing factor to the $85, $86 crude price these days, or do you think it's really just supply demand?
It does contribute a little bit, but of course it has a lot to do with the supply and demand. But again, it's the expectation of the Ukrainian situation does contribute because of the oil prices that we have been seeing. The one thing I would like to talk about a little bit, if you have time, a minute, which is I'm very excited about one other part, which I see that's potentially happening. And I did work a little bit on that, which is the ESG. And the way that, and this is related to, since you brought up the oil prices, and this is, so I think I'm going to see a lot of the ESG related investments, and the impact is going to be shown overall economy, as well as in the asset management industry. So we already know ESG going to be one of the top asset class, which is going to be traded in the market. We need a lot more development there. So this is where I am very excited. And one of the things comes up is the ratings, that how do I know what is the right E, S, and G, environment, social, and governance ratings of a company going to be, because there is a lot of issues going on in that rating. And unless that is being fixed up, we won't be able to figure out how should we actually value this kind of firms.
I mean, ratings that just don't fully represent the true social economic impact. Yes, I would very much agree with you there.
Right.
There needs to be a lot of work. And with 1 in 3 institutional dollars already in ESG, and estimates of 80% within 10 years, ESG research is going to become, it's already becoming the next, Bitcoin blockchain size for academic research, without a doubt.
Right. And this is where, again, related to this alternative data I referred to, Nowcasting is going to play a big role. One of the reasons we do not have a good ESG rating is because there's potentially a lot of greenwashing going on by the companies, as well as much of the rating information given to the rating companies are self-reported by the companies. And number 3, they are a little bit stale. They generally come from the monthly or annual quarterly reports. By that time, a lot of things had happened. And this is where the alternative information potentially comes in. Textual information analysis about what is going on inside the company. Is there a lot of debates or kind of differences amongst the board? And that kind of, could I bring that out as a governance impact on the company? Can I look at alternative energy emissions, carbon emissions data, and blend it together and see what the company is actually saying and what is the real impact actually on the ground? And blending all this alternative data together, and again, comes up with, so one of the data hackathon I participated there, we could show that this alternative data actually gives a much better rating, much better in terms of how you predict the stock prices or how you predict the future performance than the standard MSCI or Sustainalytics-based rating.
Yeah, companies are using capital to buy better ESG ratings by buying these carbon offsets, and that should not improve their ESG score, that they are contributing a certain amount of overall negativity to the planet. So I agree with you.
Right, yes.
100%. Well, this was a lot of fun, as always. Professor, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me, Alex.
No, you're the best. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.